Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. I'm going to talk a little bit about part of the content of my new book, Can Science Explain Everything? And the rest of it, I'm afraid you'll have to read for yourselves. But we're confronted today with the idea that science, first of all, can explain everything, and its basic assumption is atheistic. The philosopher Pigliucci said, the basic assumption of science is that the world can be explained entirely in physical terms without recourse to godlike entities. And Richard Dawkins, similarly, my task is to explain elephants and the world of complex things in terms of the simple things that physicists can either understand or are working on. Reduce everything to physics and chemistry. That has huge implications for our understanding of ourselves. Francis Crick, who won the Nobel Prize, he wrote this: your joys and sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. We call this reductionism. And if there is no God, then of course we have to believe that matter and energy are responsible for everything. But if they are, I don't think we'd ever know it, because in the end, that view destroys meaning. So let's examine this idea that science explains everything. The philosopher Bertrand Russell once put it this way: whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods. And what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. Now, I hope you're up for some logic. Just look at that statement. You see, is that a statement of science? No. But he claims it's knowledge. And only through science can knowledge be attained. So if that statement is true, it is completely false. It's logically incoherent. It's a nonsense statement. He was very extreme. I don't think Russell actually believed this himself, but this is commonly the view, that science gives us everything. And one of the people who has represented this idea is the late Stephen Hawking. The beginning of his book, The Grand Design, he asks a whole lot of big questions that are your questions, my questions. How can we understand the world in which we find ourselves? How does the universe behave? What is the nature of reality? Where did all this come from? Did the universe need a creator? Why do we exist? Why this particular set of laws and not some other? Why is there something rather than nothing? And he thinks that science answers them all. Well, I've looked through these questions. As far as I can see, science only answers one of them. How does the universe behave? Now, that's a very odd thing for a scientist to write, but it gets odder when Hawking tells us where we can get answers to these questions. He says traditionally they're questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. It has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly in physics. As a result, scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. Well, that amused me when I saw it. Philosophy is dead. The rest of his book, what's its topic? The philosophy of science. And what I suggest he does in the book, that philosophy is certainly dead as far as he's concerned. And he irritated the philosophy department in Cambridge, which is world famous, because of this statement. So there's great confusion here. Philosophy is simply the love of wisdom, answering the big ideas. And it includes all kinds of sources of answers to questions, and we'll look at them in a moment. So here is Hawking. One cannot prove that God doesn't exist, but science makes God unnecessary. The laws of physics can explain the universe without the need for a creator. Now get exactly what he's saying. He's not saying God doesn't exist, though that's what he believes. But in any case, science makes God unnecessary. Now, why is that? So here's his answer. Look at the last sentence. Because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. And I want to investigate that, because when I first read that, well, it inspired me to write my little book, God and Stephen Hawking, because I thought, well, because there is a law like gravity, that is, because there is something, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Because there's something, the universe creates itself from nothing. What does that sound like to you? A flat contradiction. Neither gravity nor law of gravity is nothing. But then he doesn't say because gravity exists. I love logic, you see. He says because there is a law like gravity. But what would that mean if there was no gravity? It wouldn't mean anything. And the difficulty is that I suspect that behind this, he is falling foul of an elementary but desperate mistake. And that is that the laws of nature that science has brilliantly discovered are creative. Now, last week I gave a lecture to a packed Coventry Cathedral, and my fellow lecturer was Professor Paul Davis, a physicist from Arizona State University. It's not the universe. And in that lecture, he more or less quoted this statement that he wrote some years ago. He says, there's no need to invoke anything supernatural in the origins of the universe or of life. I have never liked the idea of divine tinkering. Notice the pejorative way that's put. I haven't liked it. That's not a very scientific statement. Divine tinkering. Well, he said, it's much more inspiring to believe that a set of mathematical laws can be so clever as to bring all these things into being. That's not science, that's science fiction. I once had a little bit of a spat after a debate in which Peter Atkins was involved, the professor of physical chemistry at Oxford. And if you want to see a pretty rumbustious debate, Google Peter Atkins, John Lennox, and Southampton. I did it recently. But anyway, I said, Peter, what do you think created the universe? Oh, he said, mathematics. And I'm afraid I was so taken aback that I started to laugh. And he was annoyed. He said, what are you laughing at? Well, I said, I really am sorry, but I am a mathematician. That must be the silliest thing I've heard for a long time. He said, why is it silly? Well, I said, Peter, let me put it to you simply because you're a professor. I said, 1 and 1 make 2. Did that ever put £2 in your pocket? You see, the financial crisis was caused because some people thought that they could use mathematics to create money. And C.S. Lewis pointed out years ago that you can add 1 and 1 and 1 and 1 to all eternity, but it'll never create anything unless you've got £1. And £1, you'll never get £2. So it's a huge mistake to think that mathematics is creative. It's not even causative. Newton's laws of motion never moved a billiard ball in the history of the universe. People do that with cues. Newton's laws of motion can describe the motion, but they don't cause it. So this idea that mathematical laws created the universe is science fiction. But there's something else in Hawking's statement. He says the universe will create itself from nothing. Well, there are two problems there. For anything to create itself, it must already be in existence, mustn't it? I mean, this is just nonsense. If I say that X creates Y, roughly speaking, if you've got X, you'll get Y. If I say X creates X, then what does that prove? Well, in my book, it proves that nonsense remains nonsense even if scientists write it. It's worse still. The universe will create itself from nothing. Well, what do you mean by nothing? Absence of anything. But you see, the big question, one of Hawking's questions at the beginning is, why is there something rather than nothing? That is a very difficult question. And the answer now is that nothing creates the whole universe. How do they get that? By redefining nothing as something. And so we get Lawrence Krauss, professor of astrophysics at the same university as Paul Davies he was. He writes this. Now, some of you probably are 12 or 13 years old. What would you do if in your classroom you were presented with this statement? Surely nothing is every bit as physical as something, especially if it is to be defined as the absence of something. What? This is a serious physicist writing this. It's absolutely ridiculous. It is indeed much ado about nothing. You see, ladies and gentlemen, let me make it clear. The biblical view is that the universe comes from nothing physical. It doesn't come from nothing. It comes from God, who's not physical. God is spirit. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So the universe comes from nothing physical, but it does not come from nothing. So we've got to learn one or two simple things. Nonsense remains nonsense, even if scientists say it. But secondly, statements by scientists are not necessarily statements by science. You see, if Richard Dawkins says God is a delusion, that is a statement by a scientist. It's not a statement of science. And that is so important to realize. A brilliant Nobel Prize winner, Richard Feynman, once said this: outside his or her field, the scientist is just as dumb as the next guy. And we need to bear that in mind, and it applies to me as well. Now, does science really explain everything? Does it give us certainty? Let's listen to Lord Winston. Science is not about certainty. Science is about probability. Science is not about absolutes. We scientists give the impression that science is about the truth. It's not. It's about what is most likely. And now comes a vitally important thing. The people that tell us that science explains everything have an agenda to get across the idea that science and rationality are coextensive. They are not. And I need to push this very hard, that science is impressive, it tells us wonderful things, and I'm passionate about it, but it's limited. I mean, if science told us everything, half the subjects in schools and universities would have to be closed tomorrow. There'd be no history. There'd be no economics. There'd be no art. There'd be no languages. There'd be no literature and so on. And all of these things, Mark, are rational disciplines. They demand intellectual rigor. They demand thought, but they're not natural science. And Sir Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize, he saw this clearly, whereas Dawkins and Hawking and many others do not. That there is indeed a limit upon science is made very likely by the existence of questions that science cannot answer, and that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. These are the questions that children ask. How did everything begin? What are we all here for? what is the point of living? And we could go through a whole list of things that science cannot explain. It cannot explain mathematics and logic. It cannot explain values and ethical beliefs. It cannot explain aesthetic experience. It cannot even explain science itself. And that leads me to ask a question that you saw me answer very briefly on the screen. Where does modern science come from? Well, it comes from people like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Euler, Clark, Maxwell. What did they believe? Were they all atheists? Absolutely not. They were actually all believers in God. And Maxwell, who's often called the Scottish Einstein with good reason, in the door of the most famous physics laboratory in the world, the Cavendish in Cambridge, he had inscribed, "Great are the works of the Lord, to be studied by all who take delight in them." You see, these early pioneers of science were believers in God. And C.S. Lewis talks about it and sums it up in the last sentence here. Men became scientific. Why did they do that? Because they expected law in nature. Why did they? They expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. So the alleged conflict between science and theism is superficial. Not only can science not explain everything, we have science today because of the Christian worldview. The Christian worldview has at its heart the fact that this is an intelligible creation by a rational creator. And the early pioneers believed that science could be done, that because the human mind is a reflection of the mind of God, then science can be done. And that's why I'm so comfortable with the idea of being two things at once, a Christian and a passionate scientist, because very arguably it was Christianity that gave me my subject and gives me the worldview framework within which I do it. Now, it's often presented to us that it's science versus God, but it isn't. Look at these two people. Both of them won the Nobel Prize. Stephen Weinberg is an atheist. Charles Townes, a Christian. They're both physicists. What divides them? Not their physics. They're both geniuses. But what divides them is their worldview. Now listen carefully. The conflict, there is a conflict, as I'll explain in a moment, but it's not between science and God. It's between worldviews. Belief in God on the one hand and atheism on the other hand. And there are scientists on both sides. Well, it's strange, isn't it, that Isaac Newton, who discovered gravity, was a believer in God, and Stephen Hawking, who studied gravity, was an atheist. Both held the same chair at Cambridge. And I want to suggest very briefly that the reason that Hawking is an atheist is not because several hundred years of science have happened between Newton and him. I want to suggest there's false logic. I've shown you a bit of that. There's false ideas about the nature of God. I've mentioned those in the clip. And finally, false ideas about the nature of scientific explanation. Now, we've dealt with this. The universe is not made from anything physical. It's created and upheld by God, who is spirit, which interestingly leaves you with a choice and me with a choice today. It's either God or nothing responsible for the universe. Choose. And another Nobel Prize winner, Arno Penzias, who discovered the microwave background that gave evidence that there's a beginning to space-time, said this: astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe that was created out of nothing, one with a very delicate balance needed to provide exactly the right conditions required to permit life, and one which has an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan. That's a Nobel Prize winner talking. Now, I mentioned God of the gaps on the screen, and I'll simply summarize that by saying that many people today, particularly Dawkins, Hawking, and others, they think that someone like me who's a Christian believes in a God who's like a Greek god. I can't explain lightning, so I postulate a God of lightning. So that as science advances and explains how lightning works, that God disappears. The God of the Bible is not a God of the gaps. Indeed, if you define God like they do, as the explanation for what science has not yet explained, then of course you have to choose between God and science as a matter of logic. But they're wrong in their concept of God, because the God of the Bible is the God of the whole show. And that's a crucial difference. Someone has well put it, an expert on the ancient gods. If you want to know the difference between all these gods, Zeus, Thor, and so on, that Dawkins constantly says he doesn't believe in, and then he says, I also don't believe in Jehovah, the God of the Bible, he's making a profound mistake. And he does it right at the beginning of his new book written for young people called Outgrowing God, which was published 2 days ago. He makes the profound mistake of not realizing that the gods of the ancient Near East, all of those gods, have this in common. They were products of the material universe. The God of the Bible invented the universe. So those gods were descended from heaven and earth. The God of the Bible created heaven and earth. So let's come to science explaining everything. And I want to concentrate on a very simple example. And it's this: why is the water boiling? Well, because heat energy has been radiated through the base of the kettle, agitating the molecules of water, and it's boiling. Well, okay, but it's actually boiling because I'd love a cup of tea. Now, thank you for laughing, because it shows me that you understand that those are two explanations. They're both valid. They don't conflict. They don't compete. They complement. And what they illustrate to us at that simple level is the profoundly important idea that explanation comes in different kinds. There's scientific explanation in terms of law and mechanism, and then there's explanation in terms of personal agency. And indeed, the personal explanation tends to be more important than the scientific. People have been enjoying tea for thousands of years before they knew anything about the transfer of heat. So let me put it this way. Newton's law of gravitation no more competes with God as an explanation of the universe than the law of internal combustion competes with Henry Ford as an explanation of the motor car. But now, remember what I said to you earlier, that the early scientists were driven to their science because they believed in God. Now, I often have fun with my colleagues at Oxford and elsewhere, scientists. I say to them, what do you do science with? And when they get what I'm pointing out, they say, well, I do science with my, and then they think for a moment. They would really like to say mind, but they don't believe in the mind anymore. So they say the brain, because the brain is the mind, according to them. Well, okay, I say you do it with your brain. Let's accept that for a minute. Tell me a brief history of the brain. Oh, they say that's easy. The brain's the end product of a mindless, unguided process. I said, that's very interesting. Tell me honestly, if you believed that your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? And I push. I'm quite good at pushing. And I've never had the answer yes. Now I said, you have a problem, don't you? You're telling me that your brain, with which you do your science, is the end product of a mindless, unguided process, and yet when you think about it, you wouldn't trust anything that's the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And some of them ask me, where did you get that idea? Because they know I'm not bright enough to think of it myself. So I'm very happy to tell them that I got it from Charles Darwin, which surprises them. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Now that has been developed. And an atheist philosopher who doesn't want there to be a God, Thomas Nagel, wrote a book with an explosive subtitle that you can see there, Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the World is Almost Certainly False. And why does he think that there's a problem? Well, if the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. The difference between that and Francis Crick is staggering. Do you see what he's saying? That science, physical science, cannot explain mental phenomena. But look at the implication. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. Now, I have many reasons for being a Christian, and you will hear a lot of them today. But one of the reasons I'm not an atheist is because I'm a scientist. How could I believe a worldview that ultimately undermines the validity of the very rationality we need, not only for our science, but for any thinking whatsoever? That's the bottom line for me as I think of this whole topic. So, coming now to a conclusion. I've been talking about science and God, but what about science and Christianity? Because you see, in my new book, Can Science Explain Everything?, I'm very concerned to get across the idea that it's not just science and the God question and giving evidence of God in the universe. It's coming to the fact that the very same kind of thinking, rational thinking, that's used in the natural sciences can be used elsewhere to establish the truth of Christianity. And of course, the central thing for me is the resurrection of Jesus. C.S. Lewis says the first fact. Now we have to reason that out, and I do in the book. In the history of Christendom is a number of people who say that they've seen the resurrection. If they had died without making anyone else believe this gospel, no gospels would ever have been written. So I believe that you can come to Christianity and use not experimental science, repeating experiments, so much as historical science. But then, I'm often faced with this. You're a scientist and you believe in Christianity. That's absurd. Because in science, things are testable. Well, not always, but let it pass. Christianity cannot be tested. Who told you that? Because you see, ladies and gentlemen, Christianity can be tested. I've tested it thousands of times. You see, Jesus Christ promises, and I come to the heart of the whole business, that if we trust him and receive him as Savior and Lord, repenting of the mess we've made of our lives and of other people's lives, he gives us things. Peace with God. Do you know what peace means? He brings us forgiveness. Can you think of anything in your life you need forgiveness for? He gives us a new power to live and resist the awful things that are happening on the internet today. He gives us a new prospect for the future. Listen, how do you test Christianity? You trust him and see if it works. And sometimes, as a final comment, I meet young people like you, And here's a student who's in despair about her studies, maybe even got into a narcotic addiction. Utter despair. 6 months later, I meet her again, and she's smiling. And I said, what's happened to you? And she may say, well, I met Christ. I became a Christian. I've been born again. But what's obvious is alcohol has been replaced by food. Destruction of personality has been replaced by mended relationships. I've seen that happen hundreds of times. And when you see it happen hundreds of times, you add 2 and 2 and you get 4. So as a scientist, I test my Christianity. And I test it in my family, and I test it as I travel around speaking to folks like you. I hope that the result of today is going to be that you're going to be prepared to test it too. Thank you very much.